Welcome to today's webcast about environmental, social, and governance reporting practices. I'm very pleased to have you all participating. And before we get started, I would like to make a few announcements to keep you up to date how to interact with this webcast. First of all, at any point in time, please feel free to ask questions, raise points, or get in contact with us. You can do this in the bottom left corner of your screen, and you just type your question or remark there, and we will try to respond to it in a timely fashion during the webcast. Also, feel free to download the presentation through the file download pod in the bottom center of your screen. If you want to look at the video or the PowerPoint in full screen mode, you can do this by clicking on the 4 arrows at the top right of the screen. We would like to ask you and encourage you at the end of the meeting to fill in a very brief evaluation. It will not take you more than 2 minutes to fill that in, and it will help us to improve our service to you. If colleagues of yours would be interested in this webcast and can't attend at this point in time, they can, of course, download or watch this on demand. You can also earn CPE credits for that. During the webcast will appear short messages which you have to reply, which you have to click on, and you have to provide your full name and address in the space provided. These credits are only available during the live webcast, of course. So let's get started, and I have the pleasure of introducing to you our panelists of today. Thomas Singer is a principal researcher in corporate leadership at the Conference Board. His research focuses on corporate social responsibility and sustainability issues. Prior to joining the Conference Board, Thomas worked with Blue Sky Sustainability Consulting and Sustainability, helping clients embed sustainability into their core business. Over his career, he has supported engagements with industry leaders across sectors, focusing on strategy development, opportunity assessment, competitive analysis, and stakeholder engagement. He began his career as a management consultant with Kaiser Associates, advising clients with white space opportunities, competitive analysis, and benchmarking. He is a graduate of Tufts University. Welcome, Thomas.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Our second panelist is Anu Sausch. He is a senior sustainability researcher at the Conference Board Leadership Practice and the Conference Board Global Sustainability Center, and has over 15 years of sustainability experience working across the private, public, and third-party sector. He started his career as an environmental consultant, focusing on strategy, innovation, and compliance. And prior to joining the Conference Board, he was working with PwC. He's attended the Sustainability Leadership Program at the University of Cambridge and holds a master's degree in environmental policy from the London School of Economics. Welcome, Anu.
Thank you.
I myself, as the moderator, have worked many years in multinational companies, and I had also the pleasure of leading the Insert Social Innovation Center, and I'm now the head of the Conference Board Sustainability Center, which I want to very briefly introduce to you. This center is organizing these sustainability webcasts, but beyond that, our purpose is to support our member companies to create long-term value and positive impact through the integration of sustainability. We try to do this by producing timely, thought-provoking, and last but not least, relevant research. The scope of what we do is defined by the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and also, of course, the guidelines for responsible operation for corporations and the frameworks. We aim to be fact-based and independent, and in this day and age, this is a very important element to provide you with facts and data that you can use in your practice and rely on and trust. We have researchers in Asia, in Europe, and the US, and we are always happy to engage with you directly. So without further ado, I would like to start us with a little mention of a very recent development, which had already happened last year, but this shows that we are getting more and more momentum around ESG issues. And what I'm referring to is that Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, has again sent out a letter to CEOs. And I think citing just 2 lines out of that letter give us a good start for our discussions today. He said, "Purpose is not the sole pursuit of profits, but the animating force for achieving them. Profits are in no way inconsistent with purpose. In fact, profits and purpose are inextricably linked." So with that very strong statement from one of the largest investors, I think we should get started. And Thomas, the conference board has engaged in this sustainability practices report. Can you tell us a little bit about what research you've been doing?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Before we get into kind of the findings of what we've done, I'd like to give everyone a little background as to what it is that we've been up to. Our sustainability practices report, which some of you might be familiar with, is our annual analysis of trends in corporate sustainability reporting. And we launched this study in 2012 and have produced annual updates examining the different trends in how companies are reporting, what kinds of impacts they're reporting on, and performance levels. The data that our analysis is based on comes from Bloomberg's ESG data, and we cut that through a number of different segments, whether that's sectors or revenue groups, geography, like country, et cetera. So the raw data comes to us from Bloomberg, and we aggregate it in all sorts of different ways to highlight what those trends might be for that particular year and over time. Currently, we are looking at about 91 environmental and social practices. These include things like greenhouse gas emissions, water consumption, diversity figures, health and safety incidents, whether that's workforce accidents or fatalities, the presence of a number of policies, whether that's human rights policies, child labor policies, et cetera. So 91 environmental and social practices are tracked in our analysis. Over the years, we have updated the methodology a couple of different times, and this year was one of those times where we decided to focus a little bit more on kind of the regional comparisons and the regional trends and country level analysis. So for that reason, we tweaked some of the analysis or some of the methodology for the analysis, which really allows us to dive pretty deep into reporting trends by region. The current report looks at the reporting by the 250 largest publicly traded companies domiciled in each of the 10 largest economies in North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. So all in all, that's over 5,000 companies across 23 different countries. So a fairly robust set of data on environmental and social reporting. The other thing I'll mention is that really the workhorse behind this report is the Sustainability Practices Dashboard, which is an online tool that allows for benchmarking of sustainability reporting. So you can take a look at reporting on any one of those 91 environmental and social practices and cut that by region, by sector, and by revenue group, and generate a number of charts that can be exported to Excel and other formats as well. So if you haven't already had a chance, I would encourage you to take a look at the key findings report or play around with the dashboard as well. That's a little history on the report itself.
Thomas, let me just emphasize the dashboard, because I think that is something that our audience might really enjoy using. there is a little hurdle when you go on the website and you select the Sustainability Center and then go for the report. The problem is that before you can actually use it, you have to register if you're not permanently already registered. But that is a very small hurdle, a very small price to pay, and I encourage you to go there. If you have any difficulties accessing it, feel free to contact us and we will help you. Sorry for interrupting you.
No, that's perfectly fine. And what we'd like to do today is really share with you some of the highlights from this study, from this examination of sustainability reporting, and share with you some of the findings by region, those related to Europe, North America, and Asia Pacific. But before we get into the regional analysis, let me just start by sharing what we found kind of overall, some overall findings, some overall trends, essentially the current state of play of sustainability reporting based on our most recent analysis of this practice. And the first one, and this may not be all that surprising to many of you who are very familiar with sustainability reporting, but we found that across the board globally, sustainability reporting is not a uniform practice. There remains quite a significant difference in reporting by region, but not only just by region, but also by countries within various regions. And the reason for this variation in reporting is really the current lack of uniform standard reporting requirements across the globe. So there are obviously some emerging requirements in certain regions and in certain countries as well, but there's quite a lack of uniform requirements across the globe. So we have significant variations geographically. And even in the case of Europe, for instance, we tend to think of Europe as a whole when it comes to sustainability reporting, but we do see some fairly significant differences in reporting by companies in Western Europe versus Eastern Europe, and we can get into that in just a few minutes. The second point I'll mention is that the emergence and the continuing development of both mandatory as well as voluntary reporting instruments continues to shape the development of sustainability reporting. And many of these reporting instruments are emerging at the regional level, say the EU Directive on Non-Financial Disclosure. At the national level, that could be, for instance, the most recent UK reporting requirements related to gender pay gap disclosure. And we're also seeing a number of them coming from or being market driven. For instance, a number of stock exchanges, such as the Singapore Stock Exchange reporting guidelines. So many of these instruments, whether they be mandatory or voluntary, continue to shape reporting. And we're seeing that they play not only at the regional level, at the national level, but then also many of them are market driven. And in fact, we see how that is influenced in reporting in North America and in the US specifically. The third larger point that I'll make is that over time we've seen that larger companies tend to be those that disclose more widely, and this is true across regions. A couple of reasons for this. One is that they tend to be more subject to stakeholder scrutiny, but then I think also more importantly they tend to be more subject to reporting requirements. If you think of the EU non-financial reporting directive, most of those requirements tend to apply to the larger companies overall. So we do see a general trend across regions, across countries, where larger companies are more active in this space. The fourth overarching trend that we found is a pretty significant increase in the use of external assurance for sustainability reporting. We've actually seen this practice double in the last 5 years. As companies are increasingly required to or expected to report non-financial impacts, there is also an increasing expectation that that the reporting is of high quality and that it is reliable. So for that reason, we find that the use of external assurance has increased and will continue to be more widely adopted. Now, I do want to be clear about this. What we see is not so much a wide adoption of external assurance for an entire sustainability report or similar, but what we're actually seeing is an increase in assurance for individual impact areas or individual indicators within a report. So for instance, a company's greenhouse gas emissions reporting or energy consumption reporting might be externally assured rather than the full sustainability report. So just a point of clarification there. And the last point I'll make, and this one is quite notable, is that while we do see an increase in disclosure overall, we also want to be clear that more disclosure, more sustainability disclosure doesn't always translate into better sustainability performance. Now, this may seem like an obvious point, but I think it is important to highlight it, that more disclosure doesn't always translate into increased sustainability performance. And in fact, those reporting requirements that tend to be most effective are those that include some mechanisms for tracking performance over time, some due diligence mechanisms for ensuring that there's actually improvements in performance. Perhaps nowhere is this point more clear than in some of the data that we found on board diversity figures in Japan, for instance, where we found that virtually all companies in our sample from Japan reported the percentage of women on the board. Almost all companies reported that figure, but across the board, the median was about 3% of women were holding board seats among companies in Japan. So again, it's not so much that more reporting in itself is what's important, is that we need to make sure that we're looking not just at the levels of reporting, but also performance improvements over time. So I'll stop there. Those are some of the overarching highlights from our analysis this year. And in the next few minutes, we'll have the pleasure of going into some of the regional findings.
Thank you, Thomas. Actually, when you say more disclosure doesn't necessarily translate into better sustainability, it might be an obvious statement, but it's also a disappointing statement, I guess. And maybe later we have an opportunity to discuss this a little bit. And I can encourage the audience to type on the on the bottom left hand corner of questions or statements that you might have, and we will address them as we go along. So now I would like to invite Anu to talk to us about the part in the report that covers Europe.
Thank you. Right, first thing, just to give a bit of context in terms of looking at global averages, comparing global averages against each of the other regions. And of course, you look at the European averages, and although there's often a misconception, or there is, you often hear that European companies tend to lead or have better mature sustainability reporting practices. But when you compare and look at the region as a whole, that does not come through. And as Thomas briefly mentioned, there's a big significant gap in the practices between Western and Eastern Europe when it comes to reporting practices. Of course, when you look at countries like the UK, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, they have companies in these countries tend to have more mature practices.
To be honest, Anu, when I look at this, from my accent, people will know where I'm coming from. I'm a bit embarrassed to see a country that prides himself on their environmental performance to be very shy in reporting on it.
I guess you have to take into account that often when we go into conferences and look at sustainability websites or journals, we always hear about some companies, and we tend to hear about those companies time and again. But of course, what our research is doing is looking at the largest 250 companies by revenues in each of the 10 largest economies. And when you look at the total aggregate picture, you might not get the same feeling as when you're attending a conference with which is showcasing the best. So it is disappointing, but this is the reality of the reporting is. I guess just taking a step back to look at what's driving some of the reporting practices. We've heard about, already you mentioned about Larry Fink's letter, which is indicating interests from a particular stakeholder group. but it must be acknowledged in Europe the role EU has played to harmonize and drive non-financial reporting. The directive, which came into effect in January 2017, requires companies to include a statement on non-financial reporting in their strategic report. And although we haven't seen the impact yet, I feel it's likely in years to come we're going to see much more rapid. It's a hope, as well as you see a lot more companies taking sustainability or non-financial reporting much more seriously, and we should see an increase in the amount and the efforts companies are playing to report their non-financial matrices. So what I've done now is I'm going to pick up on 3 themes. Of course, there's lots of things which I can talk about, but I pick up on 3 themes which I'll briefly mention. So I'm going to talk about climate change. I'm going to talk about the gender pay gap, and we'll also look at what we are finding in terms of executive remuneration. So firstly, talking about climate change. Now, of course, you're to some aspect looking at around the largest 2,000 companies in Europe. Of course, they're not the largest, but still they come from each of the countries. And what is very disappointing to see, irrespective of what we have seen, the global climate movement, only around 18% of the companies report having a climate change strategy. So given that climate change is one of the most serious and challenging risks we face, the action from companies is lacking, and this is you see this is quite a slow progress being made on that front. Second,
before you go on, Anu, I find it fascinating that there seems to be a disconnect. On the one hand, with the sophisticated and advanced companies, there's a big discussion how to implement TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Risk Disclosure, financial disclosure, and here we see that there is a huge gap before we even get to that level of sophistication.
I mean, this is, and I guess this is one of the reasons I thought I would share this figure. And I guess we have to appreciate that we are looking at an aggregate figure for a large data set, almost 2,000 companies. When you look at initiatives like CDP, where a lot of companies, a lot of big companies are driving and engaging their value chains in this movement in the fight against climate change, we are still looking at a very small number of companies. And when you look at the totality, of course, it's a complete disconnect. The business world, the action is lacking from the business world. So moving on, looking at the gender pay gap, which is another hot topic in the marketplace. And of course, irrespective of the limelight or the media coverage, you look at the number of companies who actually report gender pay gap across Europe is very, very tiny. It's only 3% of those companies who are reporting gender pay gap. And I just a clarification point over here. A number of other studies which have been done across Europe, they typically find a gender pay gap of around 15 to 18%. In the sample we looked at for those companies who reported gender pay gap, that was around 7%. So the audience should not feel that actually the gender pay gap is only 7%. It's a bit higher in reality. Of course, for the sample we look at, it came out to be 7%. Another issue.
I guess what's happening here, Anu, is that where you are obliged by law to disclose it, then the reality comes to play. When you do it voluntarily, you do that when you feel relatively good about your number, so that will reduce the average. Is that a reasonable explanation?
That is reasonable explanation. Of course, for example, in the UK, the law was introduced earlier in 2018, where large companies were obliged to report their gender pay gap figures. But of course, leading up to the laws, a lot of companies started to prepare what they would be reporting and started to put in place remedial, measures in place. So of course that happens. But having said that, still in the UK, not all the companies who are obliged to report are reporting. So again, there's work being done. There is some corporations are taking actions, but many are lagging behind. This brings me on to my last theme, which I would briefly mention, is about, again, we hear a lot about how the board remuneration need to change, how ESG factors need to be incorporated in boards' remuneration packages. And what we find is that, again, if you see a similar trend is appearing here as well, UK, Netherlands, France, which we saw tend to have more mature reporting practices. Companies from these countries are more ahead in embedding ESG factors into executive remuneration, be diversity. For example, they could be a target for increasing board diversity and the chief executive is remunerated on that, or be it related to carbon performance. But these are just an indication of how companies are starting to take slightly a longer term view of performance and incorporating ESG into the remuneration. You might argue that the progress is slow, but at least it's on the radar now, and we're likely to see more of it in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Anu. And I think you made a very good point here. One shouldn't draw the conclusions from some of those disappointingly low numbers that why am I bothering? Why should I be doing this? The others are not doing it either. I think what is happening here is that there is an increasing trend. There will be more regulation coming along, and those companies who do these things will not only be reporting, but once you report on these things, you can actually work on improving your performance as well. So thank you, Anu. And Thomas, I think it's time, once we've listened to numbers from Europe, which is supposed to be leading, what does that mean when we look at the North American numbers?
Yes, and I think it's not so much that Europe is supposed to be leading and is not. And in fact, I do think the numbers are quite positive in some respects. I think that the takeaway is that there's quite a bit of variation across Europe. And in fact, if you drill down into specific countries within Europe, take the UK or Germany or France even, some of the figures, what you'll find is that they're actually fairly high or relatively high. It's when you look at the full spectrum of countries in our sample within Europe that the numbers become a little bit more modest or shocking, perhaps. So now turning into North America, as you can see here, U.S. companies are significantly ahead of their peers in Canada and Mexico in terms of overall disclosure. What we're tracking here is the average percentage of disclosure across the 91 metrics that we looked at. So if you look at the United States, that 26% essentially signifies that across the board, on average, companies in the U.S. in our sample reported on 26% of the 91 environmental and social metrics that we tracked. That is quite a bit higher than companies in Canada and Mexico, and in fact quite a bit higher than most companies or most countries in our sample. Reporting by large US companies is actually among the top 5 highest across our global sample, with countries such as Japan in the mix, and the UK, for instance. And now what's I think surprising perhaps to some is the high level of disclosure of US companies. We tend to think that US companies are kind of behind the curve a little bit in non-financial reporting and non-financial disclosure, but I think there are a couple of things at play here. One is that there's a significant amount of stakeholder pressure, including investor pressure, towards large US companies to report on some of these non-financial impacts. And that is driving disclosure even in the absence of domestic mandated reporting requirements, right? And the other thing at play here is that many of these large US companies, and remember our sample is the largest 250 companies by revenue in each of these countries. So these are generally fairly large companies. The second thing at play here is that many of these companies are actually subject to reporting requirements from other regions. Take the EU Directive on Non-Financial Disclosure again. Many of these companies that operate in Europe would be required to report on sustainability impacts as part of the EU directive. So again, even in the absence of domestic reporting requirements, there's still quite a bit of disclosure among US companies because of those two main things. One, being subject to reporting requirements overseas, and also the tremendous amount of investor and stakeholder pressure that we're seeing over the last few years. So
Thomas,
as Anu did...
Yes. Before you go on, we have a question from the audience. Where did you get the 91 metrics list from? Are they from existing standards like GRI, CDP?
Yeah, so our analysis is based on Bloomberg's ESG data, and that data comes from a number of different sources, including company sustainability reports, annual reports, information reported on company websites, questionnaires, including CDP questionnaires, to an extent, obviously GRI comes into play, and Dow Jones Sustainability Index questionnaires. But the majority of the data will be coming from companies' annual reports and sustainability reports, and the source would be Bloomberg's ESG database. So I painted a little bit of a picture of overall reporting in North America, and particularly US, but I'd like to focus on a couple of specific points, much like Anu did for Europe. And the first one is really on climate-related disclosure, because we're seeing quite a bit of activity in this space over the last year. What you can see here is climate-related disclosure in North America. We looked at three specific impact areas. One is the percentage of companies reporting having a climate change strategy. The percentage of companies including risks of climate change in their MD&A sections of their annual reports and filings. So to what extent are companies actually discussing the risk of climate change in their filings? And lastly, the percentage of companies reporting on their greenhouse gas emissions. And what is immediately obvious is that companies in the US, again, lead their peers, and particularly, Mexico, companies in Mexico tend to fall quite behind in this space. But I think the other interesting thing here is about half of large US companies now report having a climate change strategy, and similarly about half of them report their greenhouse gas emissions. So generally relatively high figures, although obviously we would like to see even more improvement in this space, but some relatively high figures. By comparison, I believe it's in the UK, about 3/4 of companies are now reporting their greenhouse gas emissions. And Anu, you can correct me if you have different data, but just to give you a sense of how US companies compare to companies in the UK, for instance. The other space that is interesting here is the inclusion of climate risks in financial filings. Again, about 1/3 of US companies are now including some sort of discussion about those climate-specific risks in their filings. This is an area that's been increasing quite a bit over the last few years, climate-related disclosure overall, and we do expect to see even more movement in this space in coming years. What I'd like to do is share with you just a few of some of the either regulatory or kind of shareholder-driven activity that's taken place in 2018 related to climate disclosure. The first one is an interesting bill in California that requires the two largest pension funds, so CalPERS and CalSTRS, to disclose their exposure to climate-related financial risks. So this is something that passed just last year. Similarly, a Climate Risk Disclosure Act was introduced last year by Senator Elizabeth Warren. The idea behind this act is to recognize that the extent of climate risk disclosure by companies to the SEC, for instance, is inadequate. That's behind this particular act. So it encourages greater disclosure of climate-related risks in SEC filings. And the last two pieces that I'll point out to is that there's been quite a bit of activity in the most recent proxy season in the US related to climate risk disclosure. A couple of shareholder proposals passed last year that requested companies conduct climate risk analyses. This is a pretty big deal, given that environmental and social proposals have been increasing in volume over the last few years, but generally speaking, the pass rates are pretty low. But in this case, we saw two proposals related specifically to climate risk analysis passing at these two companies. We also found two additional proposals that received fairly high levels of support, over 40% of votes cast, which again is a pretty strong bellwether of shareholder concerns and what shareholders are focused on for the coming year. And additionally, we saw a couple of proposals passed requesting companies report on their greenhouse gas management strategies. So just to give you a sense that there's been quite a bit of activity related to climate disclosure, not just what Uwe mentioned with TCFD coming on board and greater attention to disclosure of climate risks in financial filings, but there's also quite a bit of activity on the regulatory front and from shareholders. The second topic that I think was worth highlighting from this year's analysis is related to diversity of the board among companies in the US and North America more generally. What you'll see here is the median percentage of women versus men boards in the US, Canada, and Mexico. The numbers are pretty sobering, right? I mean, we find that about 1 in 5 women represent about 1 in 5 board members among US companies and Canadian companies. The story in Mexico is pretty dire. Company boards tend to be primarily men, right? And this is not something that is limited to Mexico. We see similar figures in a few different countries in Asia Pacific. I mentioned Japan earlier. We see almost the same figure in Japan, where the median percentage of women on company boards was about 3%. So pretty dire metrics in this space. Just to give you, again, a little bit more comparison with some countries in Europe, the US figure at 21% is in this comparison here against Mexico, for instance. But I think the highest percentage that we found across the board was in France, where women account for about 40% of board seats. And the second highest was in Italy, where we saw a figure of 33%. So the 21% in the US is, it's not the lowest, but there's also quite a bit of room for improvement. And there has been quite a bit of activity to foster greater board diversity on company boards, primarily in Europe through a number of quotas that have been in place over the last few years. And Anu can tell us a little bit more about that if there are questions. But there's also been some activity in the US related to board diversity. And some of it has been on the regulatory side, and there's been quite a bit on the shareholder side as well. So just to give you a couple of examples of what's been going on in this space, just last year, California passed an interesting law. We'll see how it remains, but essentially it requires companies that are primarily based in California, who have executive offices in California, to have at least 1 woman on their boards by the end of this year. And by the end of 2021, that minimum will increase to 3 women directors for companies with 6 or more directors. So again, some interesting activity in this space, and it's about time, given some of the figures that we've seen. We're also seeing a number of some of the large asset managers that are supporting shareholder proposals that are increasingly aimed at board diversity or improving board diversity figures. Just last year, again, we saw 5 shareholder resolutions on this topic, requesting companies improve diversity and among their board. None of those proposals passed, but again, the number of proposals that are being brought up on this topic are pretty strong bellwethers for shareholder concerns, and that there is some activity in this space, and we expect to continue to see some more activity in this space. So I'll stop there. If you have any comments, or we can move on to our next region.
I must say that I'm losing a little bit of patience with this, and I hear these people say, we don't need regulation. This has to be on a voluntary basis, and women on boards have to be by merit and not by gender, and all this nonsense. I think those companies who have embraced diversity, and not just gender diversity, are really thriving, and those who don't will, in the long run, I think, pay a dear price. So that's my very personal observation here. So apologies for being not completely unbiased.
No, that's all right. And in fact, it's an important point. I also think that this is, again, going back to one of my original comments about disclosure, and focusing exclusively on disclosure rather than performance, and how that might not be the right way to go. Again, I mentioned the Japan example, where we see, I think it's 99% of companies in our sample reported the gender makeup of their boards, but with a median of 3% of board members being women, you kind of ask, well, what are you reporting on? What are you focusing on? Are you focusing on simply transparency, or are there actually measures in place to improve performance? And at the end of the day, it's important to make sure that transparency is also followed up with performance improvement measures.
Absolutely, but that requires, of course, then some consequences from the transparent data, and we all have to play a role in this, of course. Thank you very much, Thomas. Before we wrap up, we want to cover also the third region, Asia, and this has been a research that was executed by Minji and Anke Schrader, and they both by this time of the day are excused not to present it themselves, and I appreciate that Anu has taken it upon him to talk to us about the Asian results.
Sure, thank you. Before I go on to the details of Asia Pacific, just a point to build upon board diversity. So one of the things we found that a lot of the countries where you have regulations to have a quota for a mandated quota for having a certain percentage of women on the board does not translate into having a similar number of women in senior management positions. So companies are embracing diversity in some instances to meet the regulations, to respond, to show they have a diverse board, but that does not translate into having the same number of women in senior management positions or across their organization. So regulations are important. It is driving performance, you might say, but at the same time, you need to question whether companies are embracing it in the right spirit. So that's just a reflection. So coming on to Asia Pacific, what we would do again, I would do is to present a regional view and sorry, are the graphs coming through, or you're not looking? Are you able to look at the bar graphs? No.
No, at the moment not. No.
Okay, just very briefly. So again, so we looked at 10 countries, and what we found that companies in Japan and Taiwan tend to have the most mature reporting practices, and companies, and I'll just bring up my other slides to give you a feel that I can, what we found, companies in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Pakistan, pretty much the reporting level didn't exist. It's just next to like 0 or 2%, something like that. And of course, we've already talked about how Thomas has already mentioned a couple of times that Japan companies have got more mature practices simply because of the regulatory environment existing over there.
Anu, let me just apologize for there is something happening to the PDF that we see. When you download your presentation deck, you will have the numbers in there. Apologies, we just have to talk you through the numbers here. I'm sorry.
Sorry, similarly, my next graph is the next graph isn't showing up, which essentially the key message for this graph was what we found across the 10 countries. Companies were more likely to report on social metrics as opposed to environmental metrics. So things on health and safety, employee practices, things around gender diversity, for example, as opposed to water and environment. So there's more reporting on the social indicators as opposed to environmental indicators. And it seems there's issues with the slides continues on, which I really apologize for. And essentially what we found, what we did a comparison looking at reporting performance over the last 10 years. So we had to, this part of this graph does not really rely on this piece of research. We slightly edited the data to look at whether companies are changing or have they changed their reporting practices. And what we have found that consistently across all the 10 countries we looked at, there's much more reporting which is happening now as compared to 10 years back. So that's a trend in the right direction. So there's more companies are being more transparent, more open. But as Thomas has already mentioned and questioned, what is coming about as a result of this reporting is an equally important point, and that is yet to be seen in some instances. So is there a culture of tick box? So is it a culture of using reporting, being transparent as a means to drive performance improvement? Thank you, Uwe.
No, thank you, Anu. And again, I'm sorry, we're just trying to bring the charts on, and if they upload in time, we will briefly go through them again. But I must say that for the first time, we have now issued a report that has an equal participation in Europe, US, and Asia, and I think that gives our members, when they go into the interactive tool, the possibility to really, for example, select certain sectors, compare regions. So there is a lot to be tailored for your personal needs, because it's a vast array of data. This is the last slide you were referring to, Anu. You want to pick it up there for a second again to make
sure? Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So what we are looking at is, of course, the orange dot represents reporting levels from 2009, and the blue one indicates reporting from 2018, last year. And we can say consistently across, of course, some countries more than others, we are seeing a trend in the positive direction. Of course, when you look at Japanese companies, you might say that the increment is not that high as compared to Taiwan, starting from a low base, going up to almost 30%. So we are seeing different level of improvements, but consistently the message is that there's more reporting which is happening. I also had another slide on this, and we briefly touched upon this about market-driven factors. So these are all the various countries, and what it lists is whether the stock exchanges from the respective countries requires some kind of ESG reporting. And we can see pretty much that has happened. Most of the stock exchanges in all of these countries have a requirement for companies to report on the ESG practices. Now, again, which is this, I can only say that this is a step in the right direction, and this is actually helping companies to take, and this is, and this not, we are not looking at just a handful of companies, but the whole universe of companies who are listed, large trading companies, to start embracing ESG reporting practices in their annual filings. Thank you, Uwe.
Thank you, Anu. And suffice to say that we can only scratch the surface of this data in a short webcast like this. We will be happy if your company requires a more detailed briefing to organize one of those contributors to the study, Thomas, Anu, or Anke, to speak to your team and just contact us, and we will arrange such a specific briefing, and then we can dive into some more details that you might want to know about. At this point in time, I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. Again, just feel free to type something on the bottom left-hand corner, and we will address it. Whilst you might decide to ask questions or not, I wanted to ask Thomas, based on what we've just seen in Asia. You've done this since 2012 now. What would you say, Thomas, is the trend you see within company reporting over this period of time?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things that come to mind over the years as we've looked at, as we've poured through, sustainability reporting data. The first one is that yes, reporting has increased, and for certain indicators increased quite significantly, particularly things like climate change strategies or climate risk disclosure. But what we've seen more importantly, I think, is a focus on materiality over time. So less of a focus on reporting on a breadth of indicators, so the number of things that companies are reporting on, and more of a focus on reporting on those issues that are most relevant and most impactful for a company. Again, those most material impact areas. So again, over time, the focus has been more on materiality, and that makes quite a bit of sense when you think about who's driving most of the pressure to report, that being stakeholders and investors, and increasingly so. Something else that we've seen increase over the years, and I mentioned this at the beginning of our session today, was the growth of assurance in this area. Again, sustainability reporting is not mainstream everywhere, as is pretty evident from many of the data points that we looked at today, but in some areas it's actually quite prevalent. And with that comes the need for reliability and quality of this data, with the hopes of eventually matching the quality of traditional financial reporting. So we've seen assurance increase over time. Again, it's fairly limited assurance. We're not talking about full sustainability reports being assured. We're talking mostly about a few different practices being assured, and those tend to be related to emissions, to energy consumption, in some cases to water, and in a few cases to some more social issues. But again, a largely focus on greenhouse gas emissions at this point. And the third point that I'll really mention is the real emergence of a number of reporting instruments, whether those be mandatory reporting requirements, such as what we've seen in the EU, but also those increasingly being introduced by stock exchanges, and then a number of voluntary reporting mechanisms as well, and the impact that those have had on reporting, not just on the volume of reporting, but on helping companies understand what they should be reporting on and how they should be reporting. And as many of you know, there's been kind of an emergence of a number of organizations in this space, and that group of organizations continues to develop and in some cases collaborate to help companies report on those issues that are most material. So I'll leave you with those kind of main things that we've seen over the last few years that we conducted this study.
Oh, thank you, Thomas. We actually have a question from Elaine Jost. She says, I have read some ESG reports that at a global level, environmental specific disclosures are falling behind relative to social and governance items. Do you see that trend also?
I think in the past, what we've seen, even this year, what we've seen is that the greatest disclosure tends to happen around policy items, and these are things such as having a human rights policy, an equal opportunity policy, child labor policy, a social supply chain management policy, etc. So many of these policy-related impact areas, many of which are on the social side and in some cases governance related, tend to have the highest levels of disclosure as compared to many of the environmental impact areas. So when we look at trends in kind of reporting across different impact areas, those policy related metrics have the highest disclosure rates. I don't know, I wouldn't say that means that reporting on environmental impact areas is falling behind, but it is generally what we've seen as a trend. The companies are more likely to report on those policy areas in many cases because it's easier to do so, right? It's easier to report on having a policy rather than report on specific metrics. I don't know if that really addresses the question, but overall, I don't see that as being a tremendous issue from our analysis. But happy to see if Anu has some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, just coming at it from a slightly different perspective. So what I was doing another piece of work looking at value chains and supply chains, and I found that companies were more likely to have environment-related indicators as a measure to assess performance in their supply chains. And during the interactions, what they said, because that were more easily measurable, as opposed to social indicators, which sometimes are hard to pin down. But as Thomas has mentioned, the policy levels, given the change in the dynamics, and you can say, certainly in Europe, modern slavery, for example, has catapulted the focus on human rights, which has come to fore in the last 3 years. That has meant that maybe there's a sentiment coming through that companies are also trying to address the social side, which was not being addressed before, and maybe that's why someone's, maybe that's the feeling someone has tried to relay in their report.
Yeah, thank you. When I listen to what you say, I'm also wondering, one has to think about when companies report things, what audience are they thinking of, and what is the influence of the thought about the audience on what is being reported? How do you see that? Thomas, have we lost you, or?
Oh no, that wasn't sure if that was a question for Anu. So, I mean, that is an interesting point because it raises the question of, obviously different stakeholders have different interests. The investor community has a different interest in reporting than communities, than employees, than customers, and other stakeholders. But so you have to a certain extent tailor thing to those, but you don't want to have such a mixture and a plethora of kind of stakeholder interests that reporting becomes burdensome. So at the end of the day, you have to kind of balance reporting so that it's streamlined. It doesn't take up more resources than it currently does, which is it does take up a fairly significant amount of resources. So it's ensuring that a focus on materiality is done pretty well, understanding what a company's most material, important, relevant issues are, and ensuring that you're reporting on those specific issues. By doing so, you will likely touch on most of the reporting requests from your stakeholders and their interests. And that's why we've seen kind of a move over the years towards more towards reporting on materiality rather than kind of a breadth and volume of indicators.
Thank you, Thomas, and I'm glad you're mentioning the materiality assessment, which is so important, and that is also why we are going to have a webcast on the 21st of March, where we are going to look at how companies are approaching this. We've done a large survey, and we also will have one or two company representatives talking to us about their experience. So I invite you all to attend that webcast, and the following one will be about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which we've briefly touched upon today as well, and with a special aspect of business opportunities that derive from how the Chinese government is embracing that initiative. So you're very welcome to join us on those webcasts. And I would also like to point out that we have a number of peer networking councils, the sustainability councils in the US and in Europe, procurement leadership council in Europe and also in the US. We have responsible sourcing council and environmental and regulatory affairs councils. If you're interested, just contact us and we will be happy to engage. Thank you very much for your contributions, Thomas and Anu. And before I say goodbye, I would like to remind you that you will now be placed into a very short webcast evaluation, and you will help us to improve our service to you. Thank you very much indeed. And for now, goodbye from the Conference Board Global Sustainability Center. Until soon.